Dr. Robin Smith, and on behalf of the Cura Foundation and the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Culture, I'd like to welcome you today to the first webinar in the series, Bridging Science and Faith. This series is brought to you with the support of the John Templeton Foundation and will explore how religion, faith, and spirituality can influence our health. And we also hope it will illustrate the convergence between humanities and natural sciences. Today's webinar, entitled Science and Religion, More Consonance Than Conflict, will speak to the importance of the dialogue between science and faith and the relationship between religion and health as we battle this historic pandemic. We have four esteemed speakers, Dr. and Reverend Kevin FitzGerald, who's a John A. Creighton University professor and chair of the Department of Medical Humanities at Creighton University, Dr. Aasim Padela, professor of emergency medicine, bioethics, and medical humanities at the Medical College of Wisconsin, and chairperson and director of the Initiative on Islam in Medicine, Rabbi and Dr. Edward Reichman, professor of emergency medicine and professor in the Division of Education and Bioethics at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine at Yeshiva University, and attending physician at the Montefiore Medical Center, and Dr. Tyler VanderWeele, the John L. Loeb and Francis Lehman Loeb Professor of Epidemiology in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and the director of the Human Flourishing Program and co-director of the Initiative on Health, Religion, and Spirituality at Harvard University. As we go through this incredibly difficult and stressful time for people all over the world, it's critical that we discuss the ways religion, faith, and spirituality can help us deal with adversity. And we're honored to have with us today heart surgeon and Emmy Award-winning host of the nationally syndicate health program, The Dr. Oz Show, to moderate this important discussion. Dr. Oz, over to you.
Thank you, Robin. With the promising results in vaccine development and the landmark event just 2 hours ago in Queens of the first American getting a vaccine, now we have needles in the arm. The coronavirus vaccine, however, has a lot of mistrust around it and could be one of the greatest hurdles we face in this pandemic. Oftentimes, religious exemptions are advocated and used in the anti-vaccination circles, but religious leaders agree with the science and are urging us to make science-based decisions. Now, I'm happy to welcome esteemed scholars of faith and doctors for this important discussion. By the large number of people who are on this webinar, I know this is a hot topic, and there are conflicts that we're going to get into because science is different than scientism, which came up in some of our pre-calls in preparation for this. So I look forward to a spirited discussion. We're going to start with Dr. VanderWeele. He is an epidemiologist, and you've looked at the links between religious community attendance and health outcomes, and the importance of spirituality and religion, especially in things like end-of-life care. Can you give us a little bit of an insight into the role of religion and spirituality in health?
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure being with you all here today. Religious community has profound effects on health and well-being. The work we've been carrying out at Harvard indicates that those who regularly attend religious services tend to live longer, are about a 30% reduced risk of incident depression, and about 5-fold risk lower of suicide. Additionally, the participation in religious communities tends to lead to greater levels of happiness, of purpose, of volunteering, of civic engagement, charitable giving, lower divorce rates. It might be one of the most underappreciated social determinants of health. And we've been trying to study these things with the best data and the best sorts of methods, and have again and again uncovered these important associations.
Let's start with Reverend Dr. FitzGerald, again, with a PhD in molecular genetics and bioethics. You've been able to research the use of abnormal gene expression in cancer and the ethical issues in biomedical research. So you've got a foot in both camps. How and where does science and religion overlap and provide value, and where are the conflicts?
Well, thank you very much. One of the things that I think is underappreciated is where both science and religion lead us to that sense of awe and wonder about the reality within which we live. At times, wondrously wonderful, at times fearfully wonderful as we face this pandemic today. So the question that we have before us is, how do we take those rich understandings and bring them together in a way that advances human good, both individually and societally? And I think the beauty here is these are not two different ways of knowing that are in conflict. They can actually be very synergistic. they can work together to not only help us understand on, say, a very physical level as to what's going on, but also, as you just heard from Dr. VanderWeele, how we can understand our own individual and social dynamics in such a way that we can all benefit from how we implement technology to address our needs.
Well, let me go back to Dr. VanderWeele since you brought him into this discussion. You've extensively researched congregational health, being in community. So what about the issues that the pandemic has brought up when we have lockdowns and lots of debate about whether shutting a church down or congregation or synagogue is the right thing medically, despite the fact that there's a penalty paid by the attendees?
I think it's a very good question and a very difficult question. Clearly these religious communities contribute a great deal to health and well-being, in addition, of course, to their own desired spiritual ends. And when we have come to decisions about lockdown, I think we need to take the science seriously, but we also need to realize that science needs to be accompanied by values when we go about decision making. Science does not itself supply values. The values need to come from elsewhere. Lockdowns are never dictated by science. They may sometimes be kind of a reasonable policy option, especially when there's a great deal of uncertainty, like at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think when there's that conflation of values with science, people become skeptical of science and of the scientists. And so, I think we do need to realize in these discussions about lockdowns that there are competing values at play. I think for religious people, especially who consider some form of communion with God as their primary end, the competing values are not straightforward. Having said that, I think often the issue has been presented as either the churches are closed and the synagogues are closed and the mosques are closed, or not, and they can do whatever they want. But I do think there's a sensible intermediate approach, which is to require public health measures, to require distancing, to require masks, to maybe prohibit congregational singing. And under those circumstances, going to a religious service really isn't all that much different than showing up at a grocery store. And so, I think if we were to take a better intermediate route, we could preserve the values and the ends and the contributions of religious communities, and still take these important public health precautions. And I really do think religious communities should have a sense of responsibility for doing so. It's not just about the risks one wants to take as an individual, but the fact that this is an infectious disease means that it has the opportunity to spread. So the actions taken by religious communities in this regard, respecting the public health measures, really are very important as well.
Very provocative statement you just offered, that it's our values, not the science, that dictates what we shut down. And I think we've seen that as different countries have battled this pandemic. Some countries valued elementary school education and for that reason kept those schools open. And when the science began to support that decision, they were vindicated because they were criticized by many others who said it was the wrong thing to do. But it wasn't the science, it was the values that made those decisions. I think we're seeing the same thing in church communities. And I want to come back to this issue, but I want to bring Dr. Padela in for a second to help answer this. Again, as a recognized leader in religion identity accommodation, healthcare, and has done a lot of work on the bioethics of end of life and in the fields of Muslim health disparities. So how can faith-based organizations help us fight the COVID-19 pandemic? And what is the role of religious life in this? And if you could comment also on the closure of faith-based organizations and how values impacted that in either direction.
It's a pleasure to be with you today. I think I want to take a second to talk about what we learned in medical school, that there is a biopsychosocial model. And the fact is that religious communities cater to all of these, right? So in the sense that from the bio perspective, for many communities, particularly marginalized ones, this is where they get food, right? For the social aspect, this is where they get community and people ask them about how they're doing. And for the spiritual, Dr. VanderWeele has just spoken about that. There's communion with religious leaders and with God. So I think we have to think about religious communities as centers of all of these health dimensions, not just as a spiritual health dimension. When you think of it in that way, then there's clearly a line that they can take in helping us address this pandemic. So for example, they can be centers of learning, where we take the scientific facts and dispel the myths. They can be places where people come together to check on one another in a socially distanced way. Provide that community space where you feel that there are others who care for you. They can be places where we can frame health behaviors in the context of a religious life, right? What does it mean to take care of one another? How to avoid risk, and frame these notions that are kind of really stressing us out in a way that we can think about them in a purposeful way as parcel of our religious life. And lastly, I think that what happens, and you touched upon this in terms of disparities, religious communities raise questions, make us aware, particularly those in marginalized areas, right, and impoverished and sort of food desert places, how we actually have a holistic paradigm of policy where people can come and think about both all of the religious life, but also their physical and social life as well. So I think that's what we need to do, partner in terms of dispelling myths and realize that all aspects of health are serviced sometimes by religious communities.
Well stated. Rabbi Dr. Reichman, again, as an attending physician in the emergency room, but also a lecturer in Jewish medical ethics, how should religious practices be modified in response to our environment, specifically the coronavirus pandemic? And I just want to look back historically. This is not the first pandemic humanity has weathered, and Judaism for the thousands of years it's been on the planet has had to cope with this in the past.
You are absolutely correct. First of all, thank you so much for allowing me to join in this extremely important dialogue. It's an honor and a privilege for me. But you are correct. This may be our first pandemic in our lifetimes, but surely not the first pandemic that humanity has experienced, and surely not the first pandemic that religion has encountered. And in fact, I'll give you from the Jewish perspective, back in the 1800s, in the midst of a cholera pandemic, a very prominent rabbi stood up in synagogue on the holiest day of the year in the Jewish calendar on Yom Kippur, where we are obligated to fast. And it was determined by the health authorities that one shouldn't fast during this pandemic because of the great concern for life. He stood up on the pulpit and said, I request all of you to eat today on the holiest day of the year where we would normally fast. That was clearly a religious issue, deferential to the health authorities at the time. And also fascinatingly, in another part of Europe, another rabbi made the following decree. He said that in the synagogue, and this was his own initiative, in the 1800s, in a cholera pandemic, that in synagogues in the morning, no more than 15 people should enter synagogue for morning prayers. They should add additional services, and they should rotate services. People should sign up for the services. Sounds virtually identical to what we're doing today. So we are really experiencing a lot of similarities. And I just wanted to comment briefly on the Supreme Court case, which some of you may be familiar with, which is actually brought together by both Jewish and Catholic organizations regarding restricting worshipers in a house of worship. I don't want people to misinterpret that case. The case wasn't claiming that houses of worship shouldn't shutter if medically indicated. They were simply saying they shouldn't be treated differently than other venues. One of the justices there said that there is no world in which the Constitution tolerates color-coded executive edicts that reopen liquor stores and bike shops, but shutter churches, synagogues, and mosques. But the truth is, with respect to respecting health recommendations, the Jewish community is very much respectful of those recommendations. And in some cases, finally, some synagogues have continued closures, even though health departments have allowed opening, because they were more concerned about the spread of disease even than the health department.
Let me open it up a little bit. Reverend FitzGerald, you start, and then Dr. Padela and Rabbi Reichman, you can join in this as well. What is the risk of changing the blueprint of life? This is one of the fundamental concerns. I get asked about it all day today, for example, especially as we address new scientific advancements. So you've got CRISPR, right? The ability to splice in the DNA. We have mRNA research that is going to lead to hopefully this vaccine being widely used safely. Although again, we've trialed it in 75,000 people between the two trials, but we'll see how it does in 100 million people, which we project will hit by the end of February. But again, this is an idea that was designed for cancer management, even more than vaccines. So what happens when we begin to play with the blueprint of life, even if it might be on the surface life-saving? Dr. FitzGerald, you want to start us?
Sure, that'd be great. Thank you. Interestingly enough, I mean, one of the things I think we have to realize is we've already been playing with the blueprint of life in a sense. I mean, our entire cultural evolution has actually impacted also our biology. And one of the things I think people have discovered during this pandemic is, why is it that my body temperature isn't at 98.6 like it's supposed to be? Well, one of the things we're discovering is, well, our body temperature no longer on average is 98.6. That actually was measured over 100 years ago and established then. We have changed in a sense just in that time. So the question is not, should we change? We always change. Change is just intrinsic to who we are. The question is changing toward what goal, how fast, and according to what parameters. And of course, with the incredible technologies like genome editing, CRISPR, as you mentioned, and also RNA technologies, the opportunities to make changes have increased, and the rapidity of those changes also increases. So the question now becomes, what do we use as our goals, as our values to guide our decisions about those changes? One could say, wow, we can make all these changes. Let's just do them all. Let's just have more options, more technology. The question is that better? And again, I think the preponderance of evidence shows, no, that's not what people are asking for. They're not asking for more options. They're asking for the kinds of things in their lives that help them achieve the goods they're trying to achieve, which as we've already heard, often can be community, interdependence, interaction, and all those things. So the goal here is not just to push ourselves in whatever directions we want to go willy-nilly. The goal here is to have those kinds of substantive interactions, bringing in our values, bringing in our hopes and our desires, and then saying, how does the technology serve that? Can it serve that? How can we possibly use it to those ends?
Dr. Padela?
So I wholly agree with the statement just made. I think let's take a thought experiment for a second. If we were to say that we're going to change our lungs so they can breathe on Mars because we're going to have a lot of pollution in the United States, would we want to do that? I think the problem for us is that we don't think about the ramifications of what we're doing, forcing us to change ourselves, right? So we have the coronavirus pandemic. If we said we have to now change our biology so that we can all deal with coronavirus in a way that we're going to have other pandemics, not deal with the issues that started them, that to me is a problem. And religious ethicists have to think about it in that way. Yes, to what end, but what are the consequences of the population going forth? I think the other thing to think about is that we all believe as religious leaders here that it's not just our body, right? There's a spirit, there's a drive, there's a motivation that humanity has. That's not changing. Our quest for answers today is what we had quest for answers 2,000 years ago. That's the same humanity, right? Our search for knowledge and truth, the same humanity. Those aspects I don't believe are changing. So we should not reduce ourselves just that we're going to change our biology. What makes us human, right, is our nature, both our physical nature, but also the other aspect that we all sort of deal with, right? The spirit, psychological sort of manifestations of that.
Dr. Reichman, more concretely around the biology here. I mean, if we start fooling around with the way that our cells function, and admittedly, mRNA should not affect DNA because the DNA is protected very carefully in the nucleus. Our mRNA never gets past the cytoplasm. But there might be ways for us to cure cancer and deal with future pandemics by actually changing the blueprint of our cells. Thoughts from the religious leadership, because that's where the values are coming from.
Sure, absolutely. Judaism in general not only allows, but welcomes with open arms the harnessing of nature for the betterment of humanity. Question is, are there limits? So you are starting to, you and when I say you, also the collective scientific community is really pushing the limits of this intervention. For example, mixing human and animal DNA, artificially created human beings. So Judaism does provide certain general limits. So for example, each science or each development has to be analyzed in its own merit. So if it conflicts with existing Jewish laws, each case would have to be analyzed on its own merit. But surprisingly, many of these things don't specifically conflict with any existing Jewish law. And if they are found to be safe, and if they are found to be beneficial for humanity, such as an mRNA type vaccine, they would probably be accepted within the Jewish tradition.
Dr. FitzGerald, how does contemporary science challenge the theological understanding of human beings, of what we are?
Well, and the beauty is it not only challenges it, it enriches it. So think about, the ways we understood the universe 2,000 years ago, or even our own human biology 2,000 years ago. and the way we understand it now. I mean, some people might want to say, well, that's in conflict, but why? Why isn't it the fact that we just don't integrate better the advances of our scientific knowledge, again, into that larger, more comprehensive understanding of our place in this amazing creation and where it is we want to go? So again, when we talk about this idea of a sort of necessary conflict, that's our choices. We can choose how this technology is used, how it is developed, and for whom, whose benefit. So again, getting back to this idea of, the pandemic and how is our technology going to benefit us? I think everybody agrees the advance of vaccine development has been changed forever. I mean, this is just amazing how fast these vaccines have developed. Question is, how about our distribution? Will that equally advance? Will people around the world have access to these vaccines like they've never had access before? And at the same time, will we do it in a way that protects those people, right, who might have some kind of deficient immune system in terms of vaccine response? Maybe not deficient in other ways, but can we then protect them also? Can we integrate into our whole system the complexity of the human scene so that everyone benefits?
So let's get in the brass tacks, Dr. Padela. How can science and religion work together to address these advancements and get people comfortable? For example, can or should religious leaders opine on the coronavirus vaccines?
I think they already are, right? So I believe this morning there was a Catholic statement that was submitted out in the United States. There will be a Muslim COVID task force statement coming in the next few days. I believe there was a statement from Singapore that came across my line this morning. So I think religious leaders are already opining on whether or not congregants should take the coronavirus vaccines, many different ones out there. And they're doing that for several reasons. One, again, they're trying to ally with public health authorities, right? Where are our values aligned? How can we move to address this harmful pandemic? But I think the starting point is this dialogue, Dr. Oz, right? That we have to have shared vocabulary. So for us, what is risk and what is harm from a religious lens might be different. Shuttering mosques or churches might have an effect upon aspects of life that we think are integral to us, right? Harm, both this life and the afterlife, might be weighed differently by a religious scholar. Once we have vocabulary that we can share, shared understandings around harm, risk, benefit, those are the key terms in any sort of lexicon, I think, here regarding a pandemic, then we can think about where we align together. So they are, and I think religious leaders should be involved. I think they should be on platforms with business leaders as well. There's an economic aspect, there's a religious aspect. I think we fail to do that sometimes because we want to have a conflict thesis. So I think that's the starting point. Shared vocabulary, shared understanding of risk, and then find a place of negotiation and alignment.
Have any of you, any of the four panelists, been asked by public health officials to get involved with the messaging, the expression of the values around decisions, sometimes seemingly arbitrary decisions like, closing churches but not bars, or ones that have nothing to do with religion, like closing schools? Has it come up for any of you?
From my perspective, it's come through our own community reaching out to civic authorities, but they didn't come out this way.
Any other panelists?
I would get it was an interaction that was sought from both sides of the equation in terms of healthcare systems reaching out to public health officials and saying, from a Catholic healthcare system, what can we do? How can we work together? And how does public health decision making impact the health system and its values?
Rabbi?
Yeah, I was consulted more from the medical perspective than from the religious perspective. To help inform their medical decision making, because from their perspective, if science and the physicians believe that schools should be closed, they would do as instructed.
Dr. VanderWeele, were you approached?
I mean, I've been approached by churches, even though I'm not a religious leader, and then also by news organizations and within academic context, but not public health agencies.
So let me take it to the deeper issue here. When we were talking as a group a couple of days ago in preparation for today, there was a pretty honest reflection on the respect that you all have for science, but the concerns you had about scientism. And I'll define scientism, and I love Dr. VanderWeele, if you can pick it up from here and tell me what you think it is. It's people attributing to science beliefs and values that are not quite justified or certainly altered by the perception of the person offering the advice. And this is done because scientists have to make decisions and give advice. It's also done because political leaders have to actually decide you go left or you right. You close the bar, you close the synagogue. You know, they have to make a decision. So it's hard for them. But nevertheless, it challenges a lot of people who are trying to not just follow those rules, but embrace those rules so that, because they're thought leaders in the community. So Dr. VanderWeele, scientism versus science.
Yeah, so even my understanding of scientism is not so different from yours, but I would centrally view it as that science is the only source of knowledge. And I think that simply is false. Again, science does not come up with our values. Also, our historic knowledge is not based on the same sorts of methodologic principles that we make use of in natural science. So I do think we need to acknowledge different forms of knowledge and of understanding. And I think philosophical, ethical, moral, and theological reasoning really are very important. And I think it's really those things that shape our understanding of values. And so I do think we need to keep the two distinct, but always in dialogue. And I think acknowledging the contributions of science, but acknowledging that it does need to be supplemented with values is in fact the right way forward. I think because science has so much authority today, there can be a tendency to try to slip in the values in the decision making into the science itself. But ultimately, I think that muddles things. And I think in terms of building trust within our communities and trust in science itself, which is extremely important, it's best to keep those distinctions separate, and also best to acknowledge the uncertainty within science. We often have greater certainty in science than other disciplines, but there still remains uncertainty. And we saw that early in the pandemic as well. And there were things that we would sometimes get wrong and would have to be corrected. There have been studies that have suggested that acknowledging that uncertainty within science actually leads to greater trust in the public of the scientific community. So there can be a hesitation, I think, among scientists to acknowledge uncertainty, but I would say the evidence points to acknowledging that uncertainty, in fact, increases trust of the public. So I think in terms of trying to build trust in the public, both keeping the values distinct from the science and talking about their intersection and acknowledging uncertainty is really critical.
Dr. FitzGerald, your thoughts on this issue of scientism? And I'll put it in this more specific context. It seems to me that our advances in science are progressing more rapidly than the wisdom of society to cope with those advances.
Well, and I think that's generally been the case for thousands of years, in fact. But the beauty is that, again, this may be an opportunity for us to better understand not only what science is, but what science can give us. If there's anything that is going to be constantly changing, it's our scientific understanding. That's the whole point. Why do we do research? Why do we do experiments if we think we already know everything? Well, the whole point is we obviously know we do not scientifically. So the whole expectation from science should be that it is constantly updating and constantly changing. And you can only do that if part of your understanding in the past was wrong or incomplete. So when we say science should tell us what to do, yes, but we should understand that in terms of this is the best understanding we have from science currently. This could change completely in 2 weeks. Think back just a year ago, right? How many people even had an inkling of the possibility of a virus like this and the impact it could have on our body, right? Our knowledge has increased enormously. At what cost? In part because, again, we probably weren't as prepared as we should have been intellectually, conceptually, understanding that science is going to constantly be changing. So part of our value responsibility, one could even say our faith or religious responsibility, is to acknowledge that and say, how can we construct a world where that is better understood and applied in a way, again, that allows us to care better for one another.
So Dr. Padela, I feel a sense among many Americans that there's an arrogance in science, and yet a certainty of belief is something that's more common generally in religious circles. So how do you reconcile this challenge of scientism versus religious faith?
I think we have to be honest that religious traditions also undergo evolution, right? That they are constantly changing, that both are bodies of knowledge to help inform an understanding of a topic that we'll never have perfect understanding about: who we are, what our end will be, how we're going to get there. And once you take that, you have to be aesthetically humble about both science and religious dictates. And I think that that space needs to be acknowledged both by religious leaders and scientific leaders, right? And I sit in both worlds in a sense, as a physician, also someone who's religiously adherent. But that's how I move forward. And I think that that's what the pushback is from society. When either religious authorities think they know everything, or scientific authorities think they know everything, and then we think everybody else is dumb. And that's a problem, right? We have to understand the limitations of our knowledge sets in both domains, be transparent about them to the public, and say we're making best case sort of, best hypotheses driven arguments both ways. We're taking the best data available, the best understanding we have today, but we're open to change tomorrow. And I think if we do that, then again, like Dr. VanderWeele said, people will trust us more on both domains, the religious aspects of our lives, as well as the scientific ones.
Dr. Reichman, let's give us a practical application. Can being spiritual or religious help with either preventing COVID-19 or supporting patients diagnosed with the disease? And if so, how so?
A great question. I just want, do you mind if I comment briefly on your last question? I remember reading a quote from the 16th century that said, every so often God brings plague down to the earth. Men, women, and children die seemingly indiscriminately. Doctors have no clue what's going on. They don't know who's going to live, who's going to die. And I remember thinking to myself that this quote could have been written today. And the one aspect which I think scientists need to appreciate also, and as physicians, we definitely appreciated in February, March, and April, is humility. Despite the fact that science has advanced extraordinarily, even in our lifetimes, even in the last few years, we have to appreciate, especially those of us who are believers in God, that really it's God that divines the world. Despite that we've made these advances, we still had no clue what we were dealing with. We still have millions of people that have died, and even today, we still know very little about this extraordinary virus. And I just want to quote one of the great expositors of the Jewish religion in the 20th and 21st century, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who tragically just passed away recently, in addressing the conflict between science and religion. He said that science really addresses a fundamentally different question than religion. And science really addresses the how, while religion addresses the why, and that science is descriptive, while religion is proscriptive. So I think those are very powerful words, which really impact on our discussion as well.
So if science is descriptive and religion proscriptive, how do you prescribe for a congregation tactics that might reduce the chance of getting COVID-19 or support people diagnosed with the disease?
Right. Now, obviously, you have to bring this into the practical. And in fact, these communities have been very much in dialogue, which is the very reason for this conversation, is that science, that the religious authorities cannot function in a vacuum. They cannot function with the existing science. Absolutely, categorically not. And we need to maintain the dialogue. We need to understand the latest science, and we need to apply that science to our congregations to keep everybody healthy and to keep everybody safe.
Dr. VanderWeele, I throw a question to you. As someone who's got a lot of experience with epidemiology and biostatistics, but you also understand religion and spirituality and the role they play. Where's the path for religion to play a more active role in managing people who have COVID-19? And there's lots of psychological issues. I was doing a show earlier today, and as a woman who came on, who's, to me, had post-traumatic stress disorder from her COVID. She had the illness, didn't have a bad case, did just fine, recovered fully physically, but not emotionally.
That's a very good question. I do think religion and spirituality have an important role to play, both with regard to prevention, but also with regard to coping and with healing. With respect to prevention, and we had touched upon this earlier, again, I think religious communities have an important role with regard to not spreading the virus itself, and we should be taking precautions like we discussed earlier, masks, social distancing, limiting total numbers and so on and so forth. And I think religious communities need to make clear that responsibility to their members, both within the setting of religious communities and elsewhere as well. I think each of the Christian, Muslim, and Jewish traditions have this notion of love of neighbor, and I think love of neighbor in the presence of a pandemic and the presence of an infectious disease really does require taking precautions. And I think many religious communities have done a good job of it, but that message does need to be reinforced with regard to prevention. With regard to managing the consequences of COVID-19, there have been many studies over these past decades that have suggested religion and spirituality play an important role in coping with illness, in trying to find meaning within suffering, in alleviating depression over time, and dealing with, as you were describing, the mental health consequences of illness. And I think both having a community that provides support and helps understand the situation, but having a rich set of values, an understanding of the world, and also an end in mind that extends beyond this life, really does help people in practice as well to deal with illness, including infectious disease, and to work through the often difficult mental health consequences of illness and all that it entails.
Dr. Reichman, let me go back to you just to follow up on what you said earlier. How do science and religion differ in answering the how versus why questions that were brought up by Jonathan Sachs? These are questions we face every day. And why is it important to build a dialogue, build bridges between science and faith?
This dialogue is, like I said, is absolutely essential in order for us to live in the society that we live in. I mean, for example, just to give you an idea of how there cannot be any conflict, there is no conflict. If you take a look in the Bible, there isn't a single sentence in the entire Bible that you can point to, the Torah, and say that this is in conflict with religion. I mean, with science. I mean, it's in conflict with science. Not one single sentence. And in fact, Galileo said that Scripture cannot err. It is its interpreters that err. And what we need to do is we need to message that dimension. People always think like religion is in conflict with science. Nothing could be further from the truth. As a matter of fact, in the religious history of Judaism, in every century, there were many rabbis who were themselves physicians and practiced medicine simultaneously with their practice of in the rabbinate. So this is simply something which needs to be dispelled, and especially now where there's so many advances in science and so many wonderful people both in the world of science and religion who have great knowledge that can get together and advance the world with the proper dialogue and not hark back to the past.
So Dr. Padela, how do we build the trust that everyone's speaking about and facilitate the kinds of conversations between science and faith that we want? Again, I'm going to come back to this really profound statement that we've been repeating, which is that science has the facts, faith has the values by which we apply those facts. So how would trust play a role in religion's involvement with our decision-making?
I would harken back to the idea that we have to be humble, as my colleagues have been saying, that we have to think about furnishing dialogues where we come together with the scientific facts, and then we think about what values we want to apply upon them, both social, religious, scientific values. I think we have to clarify that we're talking about two domains, right? As you've heard often, right? We're not entitled to our own facts. And today, unfortunately, we have a lot of echo chambers and a lot of myths and sort of conspiracy theories where we debate on the facts. But if we have a dialogue, we have to come forth with the facts, limitations of those scientific facts, and then think about values that we come together with, both religious ones and I'll say public health ones. So I would say that with all due respect to Rabbi Sachs, I don't think that we say that science has this role and religion has this role. I think they intertwine, right? We use the same mind to look at texts, religious texts, and understand them as we do look at medical papers. And we have to understand that this mind is always faulty, right? And we can err in both domains. And that's what I would call for. As far as trust, and I'll go back to my initial statement, I do believe that public health authorities, state authorities need to bring religious leaders at the same dialogue table and in those public sort of foray, right? When they say we want to bring religious leaders, business leaders, governmental leaders, healthcare leaders together, bring those communities together on the same platform to discuss what society should do. We're talking to the public, don't marginalize the sort of religious communities on the side and let them do their own thing. That's my humble ask of all of us.
You know, when Robin Smith invited me to the my first Cura event at the Vatican 2 years ago, I was so stunned that this had happened, that you could actually get science and faith to be meeting at that level. And then when I got to Vatican City, and there was a beautiful building adjacent to the hall we were meeting in, which started being used in the 1850s, because that's what the Vatican has been doing for 170 years, bringing scientific leaders to educate the pontiff and his team about what's going on in science. Makes sense. I don't see the reverse happening. So Dr. FitzGerald, where are these conversations between science and faith that would be required, that are necessary to engender trust? How do we achieve this?
Well, you raise a really interesting question, and the context. These conversations have been going on. They've been going on, in a sense, for thousands of years. So why is it we don't know more about them? I think in part because of a lot of public pressures that can be out there, pressures in terms of, neither side wants to be seen publicly in a way of somehow giving away their side, right? So if you enter into some kind of conversation with the other side, right, you've tainted yourself in some way. So I would ask you as a member, obviously a person in the media, how can we get the media to be more honest and transparent about this? I understand, everybody's got their bottom line, and different organizations have to, look to their groups that watch them. But can we do a better job in saying, it isn't all the way we're just telling you? There are people out there that are trying to build these bridges. I just give you some examples. The event that you came to in December 2015, we had an event at the Vatican where we brought in people from around the world to ask the question, how do we address the huge challenge of antimicrobial resistance, of these bugs that have developed resistance to our best drugs, right? How do we begin to even address that together? Because that's the only way we're going to be successful. And then recently, the Pontifical Academy for Life has announced a cooperative program that they are doing with IBM and other organizations to look at artificial intelligence and how that might be used in ways that are good for people and not necessarily leading to harm. So the dialogue is there. It is happening. We need to expand it, but we need to get behind it in terms of saying, this is valuable. Both sides want it. It's going to help us move forward in a way that everybody wants. And that's getting back to your issue of trust. Why do you trust someone? Because you think that they care about you. They care about what you care about. So how do we let other people know that we, in fact, do care about them and that we want to care together so that everybody might benefit?
Well, again, let me push you a little bit because you're all so polite. I mean, put your humbleness away and let's talk about one of the biggest issues that we're facing, which is the fact that this conversation between science and faith isn't happening, in part because I think science has invaded some of the domain that you probably think belongs to faith. When I hear people say, I believe in science and that's why I'm doing blank, there's an implication that there's an absolute truth in science and the values associated with it that dictate that they're going to wear their mask when they're walking in the park by themselves, or wearing a mask when they're exposed to a lot of other people in a mall. I mean, they're both reasons that can be justified, and a humbleness we require to acknowledge we don't have all the answers there. But when it's said in that way, it closes off any doors to again, when that comment is made, it's generally used to argue that they're people who don't know the facts and aren't following the facts and ignoring the facts. But there's a deeper reason why people are ignoring your science. It's because their values are different from your values. So let me go to actually, Dr. VanderWeele, this is exactly your sweet spot. Don't be so polite here. What is the challenge that society faces when it doesn't allow faith, even if it's not in the form of a form of religion, to play a role in how science is applied?
I know, I think that's an excellent question, and I will venture into perhaps more controversial territory here. I mean, I do fully agree that in terms of building trust, what is important is that goodwill for the other, and even those with whom one disagrees with, what we might call love for one's enemy, ones for those who are opposed to oneself. And so I think the question of how do we go about achieving that is an important one when values come into conflict. We've talked about bringing values together with science for good decision making, but on certain issues, I do think there are competing values. From my perspective, a helpful way to think about moral decision making from the Catholic tradition is what makes an act right has to do with the nature of the act itself, the intent, and the consequences. And I think often people do have good intent, but there's disagreement often with regard to the moral nature of the act itself. And so I think when we get to issues such as embryonic stem cell research or abortion, there are values that come into conflict. And so I think an important question for society and for the dialogue between religion and science is how do we proceed as a society when values come into conflict? And I think there are ways forward. There was an interesting case study with regard to a partnership between Brazil's national AIDS program and the Catholic Church. And they worked together because they felt they had common aims on prevention and on treatment, and it accomplished a great deal of good. Then Brazil's national AIDS program ran a campaign promoting condom use, and they said, condoms, it's a sin not to use it. The Catholic Church, understandably, given their positions, were very upset about this, and there was a great deal of back and forth with regard to whether this partnership was going to continue. They continued to disagree on this issue, but continued to work together because they felt there was enough of, with regard to what they did agree on, that it was worth partnering. And so I think values do come into conflict. And so an important question with regard to society, with regard to that science and religion dialogue, is how do we navigate those? How do we show goodwill for the other when we disagree, when values come into conflict? And I think this will be a critical issue for science-religion dialogue going forward in the years ahead.
Rabbi Reichman, Judaism has a lot of rules. I hear about them with great detail from a lot of my friends. And yet sometimes these principles, these specific religious practices aren't overtly used to promote health and longevity, even though they're definitely linked to them. So how do we do that? How do you take some religious practices and wisdom gained from thousands of years of trial and error or enlightened spiritual insight and apply them to the broader society in a non-denominational way?
We in the Jewish tradition have a custom to wish people a blessing. You should live till 120, which is actually the age of Moses, when Moses died. But the truth is, in our generation, that might end up being a curse. You live only to 120. We're seeing in our lifetimes the pushing of the limits of longevity. But you're right. We need to apply, and also apropos what Professor VanderWeele said, with respect to respectful disagreement. That's another dimension which is found within the Jewish tradition. If you walk into any hall of study of the Talmud today, I'm now talking 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, you'll see people screaming at each other like they're about to kill each other, to clarify issues. But then when they walk out of the hall, they go sit down to lunch together and discuss peacefully. But bringing in, with respect to your question, how do we apply this? Really, one of the pioneers of health preservation is Maimonides. Maimonides, who lived in the 12th century. His works are still being used to this very day in the fields of medicine, in the fields of philosophy. And he believed that health preservation and increasing your longevity were an essential part of religion. And he has, in his legal works, he wrote medical works, which are separate. In his legal works, he included lengthy discussions about how to preserve your health. And he said, you cannot serve God, you cannot be effective in your religious observance without your maintenance of health. If Maimonides were alive today, he would be here as part of this discussion. He would be replacing me, of course, but he would be here as part of this discussion, saying that you should be checking your blood pressure, checking your blood sugars, the most basic stuff. So you'd be having colonoscopies, you should be having imaging studies, CAT scans, mammograms. He would say you should be having genetic testing for a predisposition to disease. Whether he would say we should do genetic manipulation to increase our longevity, I can't comment on that one. That requires further analysis. But you're right. We need to bring the works of Maimonides and the likes of Maimonides into the contemporary conversation.
Dr. Padela, in Islam, there's lots of very specific daily requirements: the prayers, the cleaning. Not drinking alcohol, caffeine. The many rules that have been associated with greater longevity. How do you incorporate some of those thoughts without layering them with the religious baggage that would prevent some groups from benefiting?
Yeah, I'm going to address that, but I want to go back for 1 second about the conflict thesis. As you mentioned, the Islamic tradition has many different dictates, and one of the highest values is preservation of life. But that is interpreted to mean both this life and the afterlife. And what ends up happening is that what happens to physicians and public is when someone says, I want to prioritize my afterlife, not this life, we have conflict. So I remember doing some work in the early days of COVID-19 where a person in the mosque said, I'd rather die in prayer than die out there. Don't close the mosque. Because for him, it was, I want to prioritize my afterlife. And I think that's what ends up happening when we think there's conflicts, because we're taking the same idea of preservation of life, but extends a bit further. Now, to this notion about using religious practices, I think the social aspects, and Dr. VanderWeele mentioned this, the social aspects of community are what are the most health beneficial ones that religious communities provide, right? And the psychological notion, how you interpret things in a long wisdom history of trials and tribulations and uncertainties. So I think we should be in conversation and community that way. Would I prescribe someone to go to the mosque, right? Because that's helpful, and I've seen studies that show that's beneficial for cardiovascular health. No, I don't instrumentalize religion for that purpose. But those who do, I'd say, hey, maybe you should walk a little further if you're going to go to the mosque, right? Park your car at the end of the parking lot. But I'm not going to prescribe that for everybody else, because I don't want to instrumentalize religion and make it a health goal at the end. I want it to be a religious goal, right? So that's how I would think about it, and not try to instrumentalize religion or meditation for other purposes. I think there's more to us than just the physical, and we should leave it with that sort of wonder, as my colleague said, that wonder and awe at the other aspect of us.
Dr. FitzGerald, personalized medicine is dependent on people behaving healthily. So we've heard from Jewish and Islamic leadership on the role of religion in this ability to sort of nudge people in the right direction. How does religion play a role for that if we're going to really trust people to do the right thing? And does religion have something to teach us about being human?
Well, I certainly hope religion has something to teach us about being human. Yes, and I think that's what it's been about for, again, thousands of years. But the question is, what aspects of humanity or humankind are you looking at? Are you looking at, again, just longevity of life? Is everything to serve longevity of life? And of course, I think the various religious traditions would say, no, there's more to it than that. Not that longevity of life cannot be a good thing. It's just that it is one thing within a larger panoply of issues to address. So that gets back to what's the goal? What's the goal for everyone? Now, again, one can look at the Christian tradition, right? And the goal, in a sense, is very clear. Jesus gave it to us. Love God, love neighbor. That's it. You do that, you're good. All right. Now, of course, the big question comes up, who's my neighbor, right? Well, that's where it gets interesting, because for us, everyone is your neighbor, right? So if somebody hates you, that's your neighbor. If somebody wants to harm you, that's still your neighbor. How do you love that person? How do you show that person care in a way that actually they can recognize, right? Not telling them I'm caring for you, but actually caring for them in a way that they embrace. If you can do that, then I think we get past some of these other things, because as Dr. VanderWeele said, right, that message in Brazil, not using a condom is a sin. All right, some PR person came up with that, and they came up with that intentionally. We know it. That was a barb, right? That was intentional. Let's poke at the other side. All right, fine. Ha ha, that's fun. Now, that it can be just teasing if both sides trust each other. But if you really want to hurt the other side, right, that's the way to do it. So when we communicate in public, when we have these conversations, are we entering into this with that love of neighbor approach? Is that my value system? When I'm engaging with these other people with whom I disagree on some perhaps very important points, but can I agree with them on the fact that we all need to care for one another if we're going to move ahead the way we want to?
Dr. VanderWeele, since your name was brought up, I'll let you have the last word. What is the right way forward? How do we build greater partnerships between faith and scientific communities, and in between faith organizations where there's often conflict?
I would point to two things. First, I think valuing each side, valuing the role of religious communities in shaping health, as we've been discussing, these practices of community, of forgiveness, of gratitude, of kindness towards the other. These things contribute substantially to health and well-being, and science has shown this. But likewise, then appreciating what science brings, the insights, the rigor, the methodology, that approaching towards truth, and how we can make use of it, especially in conjunction of values to accomplish our ends. So I think both sides really do need to respect one another. And then I think secondly, going back to that notion of love of neighbor, I think if both scientists and religious communities and the general public, I mean, this issue comes up within politics, within tensions across racial lines and across religious lines. But if each person is to love their neighbor, if the goal is truly to seek the good of the other, I think that powerfully shapes trust, dialogue, and will help us to together achieve those ends which each separate community deems most important, and to discern together what those ends really ought to be.
And I want to thank all of you so much, our panelists, Reverend Dr. FitzGerald, Dr. VanderWeele for the last word, Dr. Padela, Rabbi Dr. Reichman, for taking time to be with us and to share your insights with so many viewers. We're very happy so many folks decided to tune into this webinar. So there you have it. Religious leaders agree. Let's make science-based decisions and defer to science, but not always to the scientists. And that's where the conflict will continue to arise. As we battle this pandemic, it's paramount for us to continue the interdisciplinary and interreligious dialogues and to build bridges between science and faith. I must say, concerned that science has not reached out to faith. I think we should rectify that. The ability to get the vaccine and get people to get the vaccine is a good opportunity for us to bring faith-based organizations into the fold on this. We hope our audience found this conversation informative. We're going to be sending you a follow-up questionnaire to get your feedback. Please take time to share your views with us so we can continue doing a better job in serving you. In the meantime, stay safe, healthy, and on behalf of the Cura Foundation and the Vatican's Pontifical Council of Culture, thank you for joining us. Robin Smith, I appreciate all the effort you put into this program. God bless you.